Happy Friday. Welcome to our webinar, Balancing Acts of Leading Through This Crisis that we're in. I'm joined by Rachel Barnett of Brooks Brothers and Pierre Genton of Mackenzie and Company, and also Reuben Mark, the former CEO of Colgate-Palmolive for 23 years, who is the driving force behind the Reuben Mark Initiative for organizational character and leadership involving both Columbia's Law School and Business School. My title is Managing Director, American Company, and I'm Senior Advisor to the Reuben Mark Initiative. I've been doing a lot of interviews in recent weeks with leaders, many CEO, board directors, chief human resources officers. One of the things that has struck me is that every month has a very different feel to it. I think in March, the world felt like it had just been hit by a global tsunami and the economy ground to a halt, and people were kind of reeling about how they cope with it. April felt very different as well. I mean, people are kind of settling into new interim normal. You know, can we work remotely? Can we keep doing what we're doing? And now it's May 1st, and my sense is very much people are sort of looking forward. How are we going to bring people back to work? When is the economy going to kick in again? All these concerns and getting back to some of the work that had been set aside beforehand. This health and humanitarian crisis has focused a very sharp spotlight on leadership and how leaders are navigating all the tricky balances of this crisis, the short-term and long-term needs of the company. How do you be transparent about the challenges while also inspiring confidence for all your employees? It is a true test of the character and of companies and leaders. We have two great panels to discuss some of the challenges, but before I introduce them, I want to hand it over to Reuben Mark, who, as I said, led Colgate-Palmolive as CEO for 23 years. Reuben, can you share a few words to frame up the conversation today?
Sure. Thanks, Adam. I appreciate it. Welcome to everyone to this webinar, which is a new word to me, perhaps not to you, on the a balancing act of leadership through a crisis. I guess over the years, I've learned the importance of in-depth communication and culture in a crisis, and of course, no crisis in my lifetime has been at the levels of this one. But paradoxically, of course, the character and culture of the company and the depth of the communication cannot be built in the crisis itself. It's got to be carefully constructed over a period of years. In order to make sure it functions perfectly or as close to perfectly as possible in a crisis. And a key part of that building of the character of the company is based on the partnership between the CEO, the chief executive, and the general counsel, is the amount of trust and caring that they exhibit, of course, towards one another, but most importantly, of course, to the organization. So I'm really looking forward to hearing what everybody has to say today and the various questions that Adam asked. So Adam, take it away.
Really appreciate it, Reuben. Thank you. And let's jump in. And first of all, Rachel and Pierre, thank you for joining us and making the time today. Rachel, let's start with you if we could. What is the biggest challenge you're dealing with right now?
So Brooks Brothers is the oldest apparel company in the United States. That's an iconic brand that's had a defining role throughout American history. And I'm sure a lot of folks on this call have heard about Brooks Brothers. And every president wears Brooks Brothers, pretty much every president at their inauguration. We're known for dressing Abe Lincoln. So we are an iconic brand in America today. And that's what attracted me to the role in the beginning. But if you had told me when I took this role that all of Brooks Brothers U.S. stores would be closed, the U.S. factories will have nothing to make with ties, suits, and dress shirts. Unfortunately, don't go with the national quarantine, but they do today. And I appreciate how everyone's in their jackets and their shirts today. There's zero revenue coming in from our stores, which has made it very financially stressful on us. That we're going to have to, and we did furlough a large number of workers in order for us to preserve the brand. That the furlough is going to include a lot of the members of my legal team. Plus, you and all the executives are going to have to take large pay cuts. And all of this is going to happen in a matter of days And while this is all going on, we all need to come up with a solution. We don't have much time. So if you had told me all of that when I decided to take this role, I'm not sure like retail would have been the best place for you to go in. But I would say that pretty much every challenging crisis that can happen is all happening. And it's all happening in a very short time period.
That's great. Pierre, what about you?
Look, I think the biggest challenge is we are all, I think by nature, want to be strong, resilient, aspirational people and professionals. And we're obviously living through just in a profound disruption of normal life at every level, the individual level, the community level. And I think it's augmented by tremendous uncertainty about when it's going to change. And we've seen, even as you pointed out, Adam, over the last few months, the narrative is changing in terms of what we can expect. I don't think any of us ever dreamt that the word pandemic, which for me is a word that comes out of the history books, would take over our lives as individuals, as families, as communities, the world community. And as Rachel points out, in our businesses, our colleagues, teams, departments, the whole way we've learned to operate has been really upended by this. So I think that's the biggest challenge. How do we fall back on our instincts, as I say, to be aspirational people when we're operating in such a changed circumstance?
Yeah, that's great. There is such a big and very dark cloud over the entire world right now, but we do have to look for the silver lining sometimes. So within that context, Rachel, what's one thing that's working positively right now, that's working well?
So there is one thing that I'm very proud of, and I'm proud of our company and proud of Brooks Brothers for making this happen. But I want to just give like a quick little short story because I think it's interesting in how it all came about. So initially, in the beginning of March, we closed down the factories because we have 3 American factories in North Carolina, Massachusetts, and in New York. And at the time we closed down the factories, I was watching a documentary with my husband, and it was about the titans of the industry. And in that documentary, it was about Hershey and the Hershey Company. And when they got to Mr. Hershey, they talked about the 1930s Great Depression. And they said that he realized at that moment that he needed to pivot. And then in order for him to maintain his factories, he needed to come up with a way in order to make a product that made sense during the time. So at the time, it talked about that he created the Mr. Good bar around that time because it had peanuts. And peanuts was sold as a nutritional protein bar. And he called it the Tasty Lunch. It was because of that pivot that he made, Hershey, that they were able to maintain the Hershey Company and they were able to maintain the factories. So that sort of story during this time stuck with me about having to be innovative during a pandemic. At that point, it was the Great Depression. So a few days later, and I do think sometimes the universe gives you signs, right? I got an email from our head of manufacturing and he said, "Hey, Rachel, can you join with me and can you help me figure out to convert all 3 of our US factories to making masks? We want to change them all and we want to turn them all into making masks, PPE and gowns." And I have to tell you, like my first inclination as a lawyer is I literally wrote him back and was like, no way. We make shirts, we make ties, like think of the liability. I don't know about FDA approval, like not going to happen. And that was my first email back. In fact, it was like a hell no. But then 5 minutes later, I walked outside my office and I saw Governor Cuomo on the TV on MSNBC. And it was around the exact same time when he went on TV and said, "We need these masks. Like we have such a shortage of masks and please can somebody come forward making masks?" And it was that sort of inspiration from the Hershey Company that was like, you need to pivot. And Governor Cuomo who said, "Please, can we make masks?" Where I literally 5 minutes later, like Jekyll and Hyde, I wrote back and said, let's do it. I will do anything it takes to do it. And now I can tell you the one positive thing about all of this is right now in the United States, our factories in North Carolina, in Massachusetts and New York are reopened. Our workers now have jobs and we are making masks, but we're not just making any masks. We're making US made masks quality masks, and they're now being worn by the U.S. Navy. So all of our masks are going to the U.S. Navy right now. So if anything comes out of positive it is a story to show you that you can pivot and you can find a positive light and you can do your part during the pandemic.
Yeah, it's a great story. And I think one of the themes from this for companies, I mean, if things are communicated in hashtags, it's sort of a, pivot, not panic moment, right? Because there's always an opportunity. Pierre, tell us one thing that's working well in your experience at Mackenzie, or that you're just seeing among clients too.
I might point to two things. I think the first is the way that this trauma, this period of crisis, has actually unlocked, I would say, and I see it with our consultants, I certainly see it with my colleagues in the legal department at Mackenzie, a desire and a real passion to rise to the occasion. I think rather than feeling constrained or feeling put down by this, profound disruption that we're experiencing, what I see is a desire to double down on the professionalism, the strength, the focus, the client focus, whether it's our internal clients as a legal department, our external clients, obviously as a firm, but really not allowing this crisis to stop us from helping the firm serve its clients, and to do so with confidence and with real strength. I'd also point to maybe a second thing, which is perhaps more personal, that I think many of us have commented on, which is the way in which this experience of isolation, which has really severed in so many ways the habits and the micro habits that we all rely on to sort of regulate our lives and distract ourselves and see friends and just stay balanced. I think it really has been a real reawakening and a reminder in terms of priorities in life, empathy for other people, gratitude, for what we have, spending time in a way that we have not historically, in terms of those who we love, just this kind of time at home. Also having the chance to help other people, whether it's charity, whether it's watching our healthcare professionals just, do the incredible work that they're doing. I think there's a mindfulness of being conscious of the fragility of our health and the gift of the time that we have. So there's a lot of positives that have come out of this. And maybe the last one I'll mention is just the unexpected door that this has opened for creativity, for creative solutions. I think, Rachel's story is amazing. I read something just the other day about Sir Isaac Newton. I think this is floating around the internet, this incredible story from the 17th century when he was a student at Cambridge University and there was a pandemic. And England was kind of shut down. Everyone had to go home. And he spent considerable time. He spent a year at home in the mid-17th century. He referred to this year as the Year of Wonders. This was a year in which he invented calculus and, Newtonian physics. And he never had another year like that. And I do think that's something we need to keep in mind. There's opportunity here amidst all of the disruption.
Yeah, that's great. And this is a theme that is coming up recently, again, as kind of we're moving through the phase of this crisis. One of the themes I'm hearing from many leaders, both of you touched on it, but these kind of new muscles that people are building in this moment. And now the question is becoming, can we hold on to that muscle memory? Because I think a lot of people are realizing, decision-making is faster. Right, Rachel, you touched on this. Instead of the kind of reflexive no, like what are they, like let's just say yes and then we'll figure it out. Decision making's faster, innovation. We don't have to make it perfect. Let's just start. We'll figure it out. And also the discipline of prioritization. Rather than having like 10 priorities for these quarters, in these moments, it's like, we got 3 things we can focus on. So I'd like, Pierre, maybe we're going to start with you, but just sort of reflect on that. Like if we are building or refining muscles in this crisis, how do companies hold on to them once we get on the other side of this?
Well, it's a wonderful question. I mean, I think it's going to be a moving target. I suspect there will be things that will flip back and the old muscles, as you say, will kick in. I think there's a yearning for normalcy on the part of people, and part of the way that will express itself will be a regression back to a lot of the things that people did to feel normal. Having said that, I think there will be some profound things that will endure. Some of that, I think, will be cultural. I think it's clear that we were overdoing things as human beings, certainly in the business world. Basic questions like, do we really need to travel as much as we do? Can't we do a lot more remotely or from home? Do we really need to put the pressure on our people that we have historically? So I think there are some lessons learned here that will endure. And I think the fact that they have actual practical business implications. How much real estate does a firm really need to have? How much money do we need to spend on travel and hospitality and all sorts of things going forward as businesses? These are things that businesses will consider. And so I think there'll be a combination of both cultural and operational lessons learned that I suspect will be manifest over time.
Yeah, that's great. Your thoughts, Rachel?
Yeah, I think when you have seen the worst and you've been in the trenches with executive teams, you get this sort of nothing really phases me anymore. I feel as a lawyer, before all of this, the little things would have phased me, and I said, "Oh my God, there's this much risk exposure, and this is what's going to happen." And now, when the worst has happened, it gives you such a different perspective, because now I go through I get all of my daily stuff, but then I also have to deal with the larger issues. And the daily stuff that I took so seriously seems so inconsequential to the larger stuff that happens. And I think it's going to give every executive team a lot more perspective. I completely agree with Pierre that you're also going to see changes of behavior. Remote working, I think, will be more acceptable. I do think we need to work on the boundaries, though, because I've never in my life, people call me at 7 a.m, or I'll get a call at 10 p.m. and I'll be like, well, when we all worked in an office, you didn't feel the need to call me at 7 a.m. So the boundaries has to be worked out. And then lastly, I think inefficiencies. I think this time, at least for me, you don't have time for inefficiencies. So something that's inefficient, you need to come up with a process and make it efficient as quickly as possible, because you don't have the luxury of inefficiencies anymore. And so I'm hoping that during this time that people look at their inefficiencies, like their over travel and things like that, and that they carve it back such that we become more efficient, because we just don't have the luxury anymore to be inefficient.
Right. And it's true that what you're saying about boundaries too. I'm also struck by, every single interaction is now a Zoom call. Whatever happened to a good old fashioned phone call? Talk about, I'd love to hear both your reflections about remote working. I mean, we all kind of dabbled in it a little bit. Now everybody's doing it. It has, implications not only personally, but for each of you run leadership teams. And I'm curious to hear your reflections on what's been the glue, what's been the solvent, what's been good, what's been bad about it. What are we learning about remote working as we're going through this? Rachel, maybe start with you.
I think you go through different stages of remote working. I remember in the beginning, I was putting on a Brooks Brothers dress, and then I went into yoga pants, and then I went into pajama pants. And now I've gone back and realized that actually I need to get up and get dressed and wear a nice outfit every day, because it does change your mood and how you feel. So remote working, because this is the first time I've ever been remote working. So I was emailing and saying today's yoga pants day, right? So that I have to figure out how to get more in a routine. I think remote working for me, in the beginning, I had trouble adjusting to routine because, as I mentioned, there was no boundaries. And so you just wake up and your desk is right there. And so all of a sudden, you're working at 7 a.m, and then you look up and it's 10 p.m. So on one hand, I do think that, there was a stigma about you wouldn't work as hard in remote working. And I'm seeing the exact opposite. I'm working 10 times harder, maybe also because we have 10 times more problems in remote working, because there is no boundary. There is no time for me to commute. There is no time for me to do other things. The work and the email is directly in front of me at all times. Secondly, because I do want to address this, remote working with children is a little tricky. I happen to be blessed that I have 2 boys, and they're in kindergarten and 4th grade, and they're very studious. And so they're actually they're doing their remote working, and while I'm working, they're doing their headsets and they're doing their Zoom school. But I think the challenge right now is remote working without school systems has become challenging. And I'm fortunate that I have ages of kids that I don't have to watch and that they can take care of themselves. But there are a lot of people out there that don't have the resources or the ability to continue doing their work while they're, if my kids were 2 years old or 3 years old, I would be a lot more challenged. So I do think that is also an issue that makes it more difficult during this time.
Yeah, that's a great point. Pierre, what are you learning as we go through this?
Look, I think the remote working and the use of technologies like Zoom has been a much more sort of radical surprise than many of us would have expected. I mean, the notion that we can continue to operate and move to a virtual platform is extraordinary. And I think it reminds me a little bit, I don't want to overdo it, but it reminds me almost of when the internet came in and email came in and things that would have been inconceivable as ways of doing business became normative. I do think that the effectiveness of this form of communication has been a very positive surprise for many of us. Having said that, I point to two things that I think are limitations. One is, if anything, this makes it that much more poignant, sort of missing the human touch. I mean, it's just not remotely the same thing as sitting in a business meeting or sitting having a drink with a friend or getting lunch with somebody in your department who needs to talk something through. I mean, it's just not remotely the same thing to do it in this format. The other is something that I've been thinking about, which is, as Rachel points out, now that our days are sort of so filled with these sequential video meetings, one thing that you really miss, or I do, is that I would call it the interstices between meetings. Because when you think about how we have normally operated, you go, if I want to go see Rachel, so we'll go have lunch, or we'll meet in one of our offices, and then you got that 15 minutes, you've got that 20 minutes, whatever it is, getting back to where you were going, and your brain is actually processing what just happened, thinking, Rachel made that comment, that's interesting. You think about it. It gives you a chance to absorb it and reflect on it. What I find now is, your Zoom meeting ends at 4:01, you're on another Zoom meeting or another video meeting. And your ability to actually process what just happened, think about it, reflect on it is curtailed because you have to shift your brain right into another topic. So I think there are some real limitations to this. It's pros and cons, obviously.
Yeah. And the thing about business travel, like a lot of people would complain about it, but it did create those buffers, right? You get, traveling between meetings and even, plane trips give you time to reflect and think. Right now it's from start to finish. I'd love to sort of go to higher altitude to, the theme of this webinar is balancing acts. And I think this crisis has been such a challenge for leadership, especially when it comes to communication, right? There's so many different balancing acts. On the one hand, you need to be understanding and accommodating of the stresses people are under and working from home. On the other hand, this is one of those moments you need everybody's best work, and we need to be transparent about the challenges and the realities and the pressures on the business. On the other hand, you have to inspire confidence. So, Pierre, maybe starting with you, just love you to reflect on what are the balancing acts that you see and how you think about them?
Look, I think this is a moving target. As I said before, I think we have to be responsible and thoughtful about how we communicate about it. On the one hand, I think you certainly don't want to get ahead of the facts. You don't want to overstate what you know. You don't want to be reassuring in a way that isn't responsible. And having said that, there's absolutely no reason to think that we can't manage through this well, that we can't rise to the challenge and come out the other side. I think, if anything, what we've seen from ourselves, from our families, from our teams, our departments, our firms, is a level of resilience and a level of desire to rise to the occasion, and from our societies, that I think is very confidence inspiring. So I think we have to live with the very uncomfortable uncertainty of a process that's still unfolding, and the timetable for how and when we will return to some level of normalcy is obviously a developing. But I don't think that in any way means that we need to become negative or lose, again, that sense of aspiration. I just don't see it. I think we have to evolve and we have to change. But the same instincts to do great things and be great people, aspire to being great people, I think are still there.
I completely agree with Pierre. And to go off something you said earlier, I think the balance that I feel that's probably the hardest for me right now is balancing your professionalism with your compassion and your empathy. So, you basically are making a lot of tough decisions right now during our retail apocalypse. And you get on, the phone or the Zoom call with people that you have to tell tough decisions with, like including furloughs, and you explain and you have your prepared talking points. And HR gives you the prepared talking points. And you explain that you're doing these decisions and you're making these really difficult decisions in order to survive. And we're doing these decisions, which is true. Brooks Brothers is making decisions right now in order to preserve its brand, right? Every retail person right now whose stores are all closed are making decisions in order to be healthy. And you walk through your talking points and you go through it all and you explain that this is an unprecedented time. And one of the colleagues just said to me after I went through it and, the professionalism, and she said, why can't you just say it stinks? Like, why can't you just tell me this stinks? Right. And you know what? She's right? Because at the moment, yeah, you're right, it does stink. And the reality is it's hard to have these conversations where you're balancing your professionalism. And professionalism to me brings order. And so if you're having a conversation with lots of people, and you're a leader, you want to bring that professionalism. But I also have learned that, you also want to bring the realism because it does stink. And so you can become too robotic. And I don't think that's what people need at this time. They need some empathy. And Pierre mentioned that earlier in the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it does raise a question sort of, again, let's think of the time we get beyond this. At both of your companies, I imagine there's pretty elaborate processes for developing future leaders and saying these are the qualities that matter the most, the kind of X factors that we really look for in high potentials. Love to hear from some thoughts from both of you on how those kind of calibrations, what those X factors are, how are they going to be different beyond this than they are today? What are we going to put a bigger premium on from our leaders? Who would like to start?
I'm happy to offer a thought. Look, I guess one thing that I would identify is a personal trait in people to develop as human beings. And I don't think that's something that you can impose or you can necessarily train somebody to do. I think that's an innate kind of thing where, a person really wants to live their life in a way that as they age and mature and evolve and go through crises, that they try to really integrate the lessons of experience. And to the wonderful point that Rachel just made, the reality of aging and maturing is, you got to pay your dues if you want to sing the blues. You get kicked around in life, and understanding what that means and understanding the impact of tough decisions and having the empathy and not sugarcoating things that are difficult, I think is part of that. But equally, drawing upon context and drawing upon things that you can do to help people get through these experiences. I just on a personal level, I have a friend here in our community who lost her father this week to COVID. And, in the Jewish tradition, you would pay a Shiva call, you'd go there, you'd meet with her, you'd sit with her, you'd talk to her, you'd offer words of love and comfort, and you can't do that in the situation. There's a real sense that all the normal things that you would do to try to show your love and affection for people and support have been taken away. And it also has implications on the business side. We're all dealing with an unprecedented business challenge here. So, I think Rachel's point is very well taken.
I would say I agree with everything you just said. During this time, I think what I have seen is that, you could have two different types of leaders. You could have a leader that sees the crisis and that basically goes into a little bit of a cave. Like I've actually seen that, and that's okay. And then you could have a leader that sees the crisis and pivots and steps up. And in order to step up, I do think it takes a lot of focus on the present. It takes a lot of focusing on what you can control. It takes taking day by day, and it takes a fundamental understanding of control what you can control, but don't get caught up on things you can't control. And that to me is what makes a good leader, because I've now, been able to see leaders and I can see when they're clear. And I'll say to someone, I'll say, oh, you're being very clear right now. Like your decision-making is very clear. But I can also notice when a leader is not being clear. And I think personally, what I practice, some sort of, mindfulness. Everyone has their own sort of things that they practice. But personally, for me, in order to get clear, you have to accept that you didn't cause this pandemic. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't, you're not Bill Gates, putting together a vaccine right now. And so what you can do is handle what's in front of you. And if you take that position and you just look at every day, day by day, and you lead with clarity, then that's the best thing you could ask for at the time.
Yeah, that's great. And just going back to point of sort of every month has had a different feel to it. I mean, for all of us who are lucky enough to be kind of in the, knowledge workers and to be fully employed, we don't have immediate, economic or health risks. Every month to me has kind of had a different mood to that. March was like, can this be? Is this really happening? And just kind of reeling from it. My sense from talking to a lot of people in March was like, okay, I'm in the groove. I think I've got this. We'll work this out. And now what I'm starting to hear from people is like, okay, this is not, I'm kind of fed up. I don't know about either of you, but I'm finding this, it's almost like this fog that is settling around my brain during the day sometimes with a lot of meetings that I have to work really hard to make sure, I sort of keep that at bay. So that's a setup just for a personal question for each of you. Like, how are each of you dealing with this crisis on a day-to-day basis to, you're in leadership positions. A lot of people are relying on you. It's like the airline thing. You have to put the oxygen mask on yourself first before you can take care of somebody else. So how are you just from a day-to-day basis, like creating boundaries, restoring your energy, staying centered? Rachel, you're smiling. Would you like to start?
I mean, well, one thing I'm doing, which is a new thing, is eating too much Nutella. I will tell you that has been a new thing for me. I never was a Nutella fan, but for whatever reason, there's something in Nutella that is like, all right, well, I'm eating Nutella and life is good. So that is one personal thing. I am trying to get out and get fresh air because fresh air is very important for us all. So if I can take a walk, I will take a walk and I'll wear my Brooks Brothers mask while I'll take that walk. And basically at this point, it's funny, you go through the stages. My stage in March, we went into an executive board meeting that Monday, which, in hindsight, probably not a good idea, but nobody really understood the gravity and the extent of coronavirus in the early March in New York. And so my March was in quarantine. The beginning was, oh my God, did I just contract it? And thank God I did not, right? So my March was more scared about the physical sickness. And then, by April, right, like even my husband at one point was like, so you went into the city those couple of days, so I'm going to go sleep somewhere else these couple of days, right? And so, and I was like, well, you've been with me for these last couple of days, so I think if I have it, you have it. But thank God I didn't get sick. So that was also, so you're dealing with all of this work crisis, but you're also, I have to tell you, what kept me up at night was not so much the work crisis, was actually the concern that I actually contracted corona during this time. And then secondly, I do keep this personally, this little card by my desk during this time, right? Because sometimes you just need some sort of reminders. And this is what the card says. It says, just relax and release and deal only with what's left in front of you. You do not need to worry about the rest. And that is just another way of just saying you just need to accept the chaos. And once you accept that chaos, then you can probably lead a lot better.
Yeah, that's great. Pierre, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to share sort of the way I've approached it. I think the one thing I would say before doing so is I feel like even the ability to look at this experience and sort of derive some meaning from it and personal growth from it in some way, I think that's a very luxurious place to be. Strange as that may sound, I think the level of desperation and the level of suffering that this is causing to people is also clear. And I mean, we put on our masks and we go to the store, and the folks who are working in the store every day, delivering the food, doing the thing, they're living a different level of risk. And I just think that we should acknowledge that even our ability to think in contemplative terms about this experience is itself a luxurious thing in its own way, a privileged thing. I mean, to me, I would point to maybe three things. One is I'm a religious person. I'm an observant Jew, and I find that religious tradition has provided me with enormous context and enormous inspiration, I would say, throughout my life, but certainly now. Second, I would say is music. Play a lot of music on guitar and piano, a lot of blues. And the third, I would say, is reading. I just find reading, it is such an important thing. I mean, it sounds prosaic to say, but, the Bible teaches us, "En chadash tachat hashemesh." There's nothing new under the sun. And when you read poetry, when you read classics, when you read history, what you see is what we're going through is not new. Other generations and other societies have dealt with these kinds of challenges before. I talked about Isaac Newton. And I think we can derive a lot of comfort and a lot of context from recognizing that what we're going through is not unique in human history at all.
Yeah, it's so true. And the point you started out with, I just want to echo. I mean, for those of us who are lucky enough to be okay, from a health perspective, from financial perspective, I've just never felt so many moments of gratitude over a particular day than I am now. So let's get back to the leadership challenge. And, I've been hosting a few of these webinars, and I've found an interesting conversation just around the topic of tough conversations. Because if you're in a leadership conversation, there's bad financial news you're dealing with. Could you each give us a sense of what's a particularly tough conversation? Obviously don't need the details of who and the topic, but just the flavor of the conversation and how you approach that and work through it. Rachel, maybe start us off.
I mean, I think it's obvious in the circumstance I'm in, the toughest from a humanistic conversation is with the employees who you have to furlough. That is a very tough conversation. And I've seen it all. Like one conversation, I had someone crying saying that they, have a mortgage to pay. And that's when the right move is to be a little bit empathetic and to be compassionate during the time. Those are really tough conversations. I had one conversation where someone says, in my entire life, I've never applied for unemployment. That's a tough conversation. So in terms of tough conversations from an empathetic and compassion perspective, having to call someone and having to furlough somebody during this time while all your stores are closed is a very tough conversation to have. Right. The other tough conversations that I'm having right now is I pretty much have every single landlord on my cell phone calling me 5 or 6 times a day. And that's a tough conversation too, because one, they're usually screaming at me. It's usually not sounds great, you're not paying rent. But the reality is, it's a tough conversation to say, stop being so short-sighted. Do you want to have, stores that are empty? And I think the hardest thing for me is that I know that if I can't close the negotiation with the landlord, that there's a chance that the store would have to close. And that's reality in retail apocalypse. And when the store closes, then I pivot to a tough conversation of having to furlough those employees. And so I think during this time, anybody who's in retail is having very tough conversations with landlords and very tough conversations with their employees. And hopefully we'll all come out of this and this will be a new normal. And unfortunately, people are going to have to make sacrifices and people are going to have to make compromises, because otherwise the reality is that if you don't make sacrifices and compromises, what you're left with is an empty store and unemployed people. And that is honestly what keeps me up every single night, and why every morning I wake up and say, what can I do to avoid that consequence?
Yeah, that's great. Pierre?
I think the conversations that are difficult are conversations with people who pride themselves on being strong and effective professionals, and that's their reputation and that's their identity, and they find themselves in very small homes, different parts of the world, with their kids, with their spouse, with others perhaps, and it's very, very difficult day after day to maintain the level of professional performance that they view as fundamental to who they are. Whether it's the environment that they're in, the people walking in the background, the kids coming over and grabbing mommy or daddy in the middle of the video, whatever it is, or just the being cloistered and not being able to go outside because the social distancing is not doable or not permitted. I don't think there's any way that weeks and months of that could not impact people. And I think part of what you have to do is you have to really get back to what is essential and what's important. Most of that is just wholly unimportant in terms of some notion of what professionalism looks like. I really think professionalism and leadership, which is not just something shown by leaders, it's shown by people every day. It all, you get up and you go to the supermarket to package food. That's leadership in this environment. That's it. It's incredible what people are doing. Again, I come back to the healthcare workers. My sister-in-law is a doctor in Atlanta, puts on her hazmat suit and goes out every day. And I mean, the mental and emotional toll of all of that. But I think even for lawyers and folks like folks in our departments who are not going into hospitals every day, it's they want to be great professionals, and this is a challenge to do that. And I think you just have to kind of remind them in these conversations, it's all okay. We've got to cut each other a level of slack, and we got to focus on what's really important and not spend even a second getting hung up on things that just don't make any difference. We've got to get through this period. We've got to support each other. And to me, that's the key message in these difficult conversations.
Yeah. And it really is, especially with everybody in the same boat together. I think it's created an ability for top leaders to try to kind of drop some of the facade. And, people talk about being more vulnerable. And I think a lot of leaders struggle with that, like balancing confidence with vulnerability, but it's almost out of necessity. I mean, I recently interviewed the U.S. chairman of PwC, and he was on a call with 55,000 employees and shared the story with everyone that he's got 6 kids at home, and their family had their blow-up moment on Friday. And he said he got hundreds of emails from employees just saying, "Thank you for saying that. It's good to know it's not just me." Throughout this, we've been encouraging participants on this webinar to send in questions. So I'd like to read one. This is from Todd Jick, who's a B School professor at Columbia. He says, in tracking and studying layoff announcements from CEOs, there is an astoundingly wide range in terms of balancing professionalism and compassion versus horribly legal and formal. Our chief legal officer is in a tough spot on shaping these announcements to find the right balance. Again, speaking to this theme of the balancing acts of leadership, love to get some reflections from both of you, maybe within the context of your own company, but just, your observation of your peers in different companies. And I think Todd's point is well taken, that you do see different kind of tones from companies as they're handling these tough announcements. So any thoughts?
I always have thought, I think you obviously need to make sure you hit your professional, speak, because that's what you're required to do. But at the end of the day, like, people want to be treated with respect, and people want to make sure you understand you're listening to them, and that you do show some compassion. And it is a tricky balancing test, but people want to see that you're human. And so, especially during these times, and I made that, that example earlier on where someone just said, why can't you just say this stinks? Like, why can't you just say, like, it's horrible you have to go on unemployment? Like, why can't you just acknowledge this, the toughness and the challenges of these circumstances? And, when before all of this, I used to when I was a litigator at Scandian, one of the things I did notice is that the people that end up suing you are sometimes the people that felt that conversation you had with them, that termination conversation, or that conversation that you had with them that was difficult, the ones that are more likely to bring a lawsuit are the ones, and this is coming from a lawyer, and the ones that are more likely to be hurt are the people that felt that they weren't treated humanly during a difficult conversation. And I've always noticed that throughout my practice because, you can see the hurt and you can see the emotions, and people act out of emotions that they feel that they weren't listened to. And so, one, because you are a human being, you should be realistic and you should be real. I'm more of a direct person and I am more of a real person. So I will tell you how it is. Two, I think it limits your exposure by being somewhat direct and real. And three, you should be real because that's the right thing to do in this pandemic. And we're not robots, we're human beings, and we should recognize that fact.
Pierre, your observations?
I think it's hard to top what Rachel just said. I think it was so spot on. I was an in-house lawyer on Wall Street for almost 20 years. And I think, nobody ever knows how they're going to react to being laid off until it happens. And I think that the point that Rachel made about people are intelligent, people understand business realities, people are not living in la la land, they understand the business world. By the same token, these are moments where respect and straight talk and compassion and just being open, I think, has a real place. So very much endorse what Rachel suggested.
And as we're going through this, I think the best leaders are always kind of processing moments and experiences and asking themselves, what am I learning from this? What am I learning from this? And always kind of writing our own playbooks on how to be a more effective leader that works for us in an authentic way and for different contexts. So I'd just love to ask each of you, what has this crisis, what have each of you learned from this crisis that you're adding to your own personal playbook on leadership, key leadership lessons that have emerged from you that are going to inform the way you lead in the future?
I guess for me, this crisis has been very up and down. It's like, 1 minute you wake up and you think you have like a solution, and then something happens. And all of a sudden there's shelter in place orders all around the country. And now all your stores are really closed, right? Before it was like, well, maybe we'll close some stores, right? And so every day, your mind goes into these directions of like, oh my God, this just happened. And oh my God, this just happened. And when things change at such a quick pace, I've been recently stopping and saying, remember when I was thinking this? Remember the other day I was thinking this? Well, that's not what happened. Right. And so I think through anything, I'm really doing everything I can to practice focusing on what I can actually control. And I'm hoping that when your entire world around you is essentially in chaos, that lesson, that if you can focus on what you can control, I hope that I'll be able to, when we get to some sort of new normal, I hope that same lesson, I won't have as many chaotic things and as many changes going on, hopefully on a daily basis. But the lesson of you have to accept that you can't control it all, but you can lead on the things you can control is something I really hope that I take with us, because you really get to practice that when you're in a pandemic in the middle of like chaos.
Yeah, that's great. Pierre?
First of all, look, I think the point that Rachel has made several times about controlling what you can control and not getting distracted and focus on things that you can't control, I think is a core concept in many traditions and many philosophical traditions. Camus says, at the beginning of the myth of Sisyphus, "Oh, my soul, aspire not to the immortal, but to exhaust the limits of the possible." I think that's what we have to do right now, is exhaust the limits of the possible, and what's beyond what is possible, there's not a lot of point spending time and getting ourselves worked up. I do think that the other thing that this crisis has validated for me is just some of the basic tools of getting through, keep on keeping on, as Dylan would say, which are born of experience. Being positive in outlook, staying positive, being pragmatic in assessing things. Don't go to worst case scenarios. Be factual, be pragmatic, and also being bold and creative in our solution thinking. I just don't think that as tough as this is and as sorrowful as a lot of this is, it means that we stop trying to be great people and great professionals. This is another context in which to do that. And so that's kind of the way in which I look at it. I just think our instincts are still there, and our desire to do great things are still there, and we're playing in a different battlefield now. But I think we should remember that, that hasn't gone away, and that should, I think, give us some inspiration, I think, for the future.
Okay, that's great. And I'm keeping my eye on the clock. I've got one last question for both of you, and then Reuben, maybe you might have a couple of final remarks just to wrap things up for us. Final question. Whenever we have a big crisis like this, 9/11, the financial crisis of 2008, there's a lot of conversation in the moment that the spirit of it is sort of like things are going to be different forever, right? This is going to have permanent changes to the way we live. And there's always a mix of, is that true or not? But as you look into your crystal balls on the other side of this crisis, I'd love to hear final predictions from you about what is going to change, what isn't going to change. Who'd like to go first?
I'm going to take that one. What do you think? I want to hear what Mackenzie thinks too.
Well, we talked a little bit about this, I think, before. On one level, I think we're always changing. We talked before about the internet. We talked before about the world is always evolving. The business world is always evolving. So I don't think it was as if it was static before and suddenly we have this pandemic and now things are going to be meaningfully different. I think the world has always been in a state, obviously, of evolution. Will continue to be that. Look, I think there are some realities that this experiment, if you will, in business operations has revealed. If you had told a client 6 months ago CEO said, I want you to come meet with me from 9 to 10 in Paris tomorrow, everybody would have said, okay, we'll be right there. Now, because we've had this forced experiment where you can't do that, it's become clear to both sides from a sustainability standpoint, from a cost standpoint, from a lot of standpoints, maybe we don't need to do that all the time. So I think things like that, Adam, will be enduring, because they've shown to be effective and they have other collateral positives, socially and otherwise, that we would want to maintain.
Yeah, that's great. So, Reuben, if I could bring you in and ask a question of you, you mentioned at the outset that during times of crisis that the working relationship between the general counsel and the CEO was so crucial. Could you talk a bit more about that? And is it from your own personal experience, your observation from your peers, other CEOs, but just talk about how that connective tissue between the CEO and GC is so important in times of crisis?
Well, I think that can you hear me, by the way?
Yes, we can. Thanks.
I think that the relationship has to be such that everybody is, as I say, singing from the same hymn book, that I have to be able to count on that the legal department, as personified by the general counsel, is going to intuitively have the same reaction that I'm going to have. Without pointing fingers, the thought that I don't think I would think of, gee, should we get one of those PPP loans? And the general counsel would think differently. I would think we would, that's such an obvious and simple thing. But the intuition that what are you thinking and what am I thinking, and how, if there are minor differences, how do we bring them together? And don't forget that the general counsel is in charge, as Rachel is, of a whole group of practicing lawyers. And again, the same cultural aspect has to be instilled in them by the general counsel. So the everyday decisions that come along will be taken with the company character and culture in mind. Otherwise, all bets are off. But I thought today was extraordinary. I thought there were some wonderful insights, and most importantly, I think it demonstrated how each of us, in whatever position we hold, or in our personal lives, or family, or anything else, has a real challenge during this crisis, and that practicing of leadership techniques, both personally and in terms of business, are vital. And when else will you get a more tragic but a more promising, in some sense, opportunity to do so?
Those are great summary. Yeah, thank you so much, Reuben. Those are great summary thoughts. I am looking at the clock, so I'm going to say a few thank yous. Thank you to Rachel Barnett and Pierre Genton for giving us your time and sharing not just your insights, but we really appreciate your candor. Just about this is a very human moment, and it was just great to hear how both of you are working through this personally, and also your incredibly sharp insights on what it means for business and the legal profession and from a leadership point of view. Thank you to Olivia Haynes and Tracy Rosenthal in the background for pulling all this together and making it happen. And thank you to everybody who took the time to join this webinar. We sincerely hope that you learned something from it. I know I did, and we do appreciate your time. So until the next one, thank you to everybody, and stay safe.